model. The best process I have come across, and I've been doing this ever since that time I told you about early in my career, the best process I've come across for helping people sort out how to do innovation is a creative problem-solving process. Creative problem-solving was kind of invented in the early 1950s by a gentleman by the name of Alex Osborne. Alex was the O in BBDO. Alex happened to live in Buffalo. Alex happened to have a buddy at Buffalo State. Alex realized, I can't take this further and teach people about this process and why it's working in my advertising company unless I start figuring out how to teach it to people and how do they actually engage in the process of creative problem solving. So he worked with Parnes for about the next 20 years, and they basically evolved the original model for creative problem solving. And this model is a model I've redrawn from the book Creative Leadership and my colleagues Puccio, Mance, and Murdoch. They do a lovely job of representing theirs, but I said to Gerard, when I'm talking to executives, I need something that I can point to them what I'm doing. So this helps surface the process that I use and gives them a little bit of comfort about what it is. But basically what the process says is, if we're working on a challenge and we want to get into something that's innovative, we need to be really clear on what is the problem or the target or the direction or the vision or any of those things. Where are we going? What is it that we want to create? And once we're clear on that, we can then start looking at how do we then start turning ideas and transforming them into something that we can use. And from there, what we do is we then figure out how do we get it implemented. And so what they did with this model is as they started looking at it more, they evolved the model to say there's very distinct thinking skills that happen at each of these processes. And how can we teach people about using those skills so they can interact better with this process and drive innovation a lot more easily? So this is the model that Foresight is based on. And what I want to do is just kind of take you through some of the things that need to happen. If you're engaging in innovation and you are using a very deliberate process like creative problem solving, some of the things we've learned over the years is there's very distinctive thinking and behaviors that you need to bring to the table. And so what I want to do is give you a quick slice through those so you get to start to put your head around as a leader. If you want to be doing some creative leadership, what are some of the skills and activities that you need to be engaging in? One of the first things we teach people is you need to stop thinking by creating ideas and evaluating them at the same time. We actually say separate your thinking. Stop thinking the way you've been thinking, think differently. And how we do that is we recognize that there's two types of thinking. The first one is divergent thinking. The second is convergent. Fancy words. When I'm teaching creativity and innovation, this is what I say to the people I'm working with. When we're diverging, we're doing what's called creative thinking. The idea is to generate a lot of ideas. So you notice we go from a smaller point and we get wider. And it's all about the ideas and it's all about the quantity. We're not worried about quality. We're worried about novelty. That's all we want. Novel and lots. And what we then do is once we've kind of generated those ideas, we then switch over to a more evaluative thinking where the sane voice of reason comes out and starts criticizing and evaluating and analyzing what's going to work based on the environment that we work in. From a simple standpoint, I call creative thinking making lists. It's just make the list. What are the options? Where are the places we could go? What are the things we need to think about? Where can we go get the data? Where can we not get the data? What do we know versus don't know? Those sorts of things. We just want to start making lists and exploring where things are at. And we have very specific guidelines for that thinking that we use. And the first one we teach people is stop judging. When somebody walks into your office with an idea, don't judge it. Defer your judgment. Work with that idea for a little bit of time. And so when we're doing proper brainstorming or we're working with a group that's focused on doing problem solving, we're saying defer the judgment, go for quantity, make connections to what you know or the ideas that other people are doing, get those insights, find ways to do it, and then make sure you keep that novelty aspect in it. If you aren't bringing something that's different into it, you're not doing creative thinking. You need to kind of go that way. It's got to be different. It's got to push the envelope. It's got to be something that you haven't done before. When we're working on a critical thinking, what we're doing is making choices as opposed to making the list. We're taking the list and we're sifting through it, applying very specific guidelines. Those guidelines are apply affirmative judgments. We're only going to choose the ideas that get us closer to where we want to go, based on the criteria that we're using to select them. What we also want to do is remember to keep the novelty alive. I see this happen so often. We go through like 2 days of planning and sorting out, and then they start to do their selection, and they kick out everything that's different. It's like, whoa, hang on. Why did you invite me in? Like, you want something creative. Let's make sure we keep that stuff in there. Let's take a few risks and go a little differently. And then what we also do is we're constantly checking the choices that we're making against our objectives and our criteria, as well as staying focused on what's the end product and where do we want to go. So we're doing it all with a very distinct purpose. So it's a very different process. What we also teach people is something called the wildcard principle. And the wildcard principle really throws people initially because we say, you know what, we want you to think, and then we want you to stop thinking. And we call that allow for incubation. And the whole concept is take breaks, let things sit, sleep on it, walk away, go have a coffee, schedule a meeting a week later, and then make your choices. So we're deliberately separating out the idea generation with the selection simply by either putting some time or some space in between them. Now, we define allow for incubation as purposely taking a break. And what I find really interesting is when I ask people to please do that, the first thing they say is, but we've got this time pressure, we've got to meet this deadline, we've got to do this other thing. And I think this goes back to what John was talking about at the beginning of his presentation when he said we've got these stressed out workers who are trying to do so much more with so much less in so much little time. And I think if we start to recognize how our brains work, our brains can't work that way. We think our bodies can, but our brains can't. And our brains need breaks. And if we give it that break, we get better production, we make better connections, and we can have a more creative thing. And I don't think there's too many deadlines that can't be worked in a different way or making some different choices around how you actually get there. And so that's what that is. So a few of the other things, this goes back to the IBM study. They said, hey, things are really complex. Well, one of the skills that we have in the model is the whole concept of tolerating complexity. And that's being able to juggle more than one thing at a time and make sense of things as it comes to you. And I think that's a real skill. And I think how we can get really good at that is recognizing when we need to step away. And so if you kind of couple tolerating complexity with allow for incubation, I think you give yourself some breathing space to literally get your head around what's going on. The other thing that happens is, or another skill, is called tolerance for ambiguity. Now this is the one that people feel like the pins are kind of being moved out from their feet, and they find this a little wobbly. But the idea is to simply recognize that we don't know everything. And I've been doing some study into how executives are making decisions. And the reality is we think they make decisions with all the data and the studies and the logic and, right? What do we want? When we have a tough decision to make, we start reaching for data because it's really comfortable. But you know, in all of the studies around how executives do their decision making, they use that to justify or not justify what their gut's telling them about the leap of faith that they need to take. And so they're really making a lot of decisions from an intuitive aspect. And I think what this tolerance for ambiguity does is it says, you know what, I can go and kind of go with where I'm feeling or my gut in relation to this, and it's okay if I don't have all the information. And this is where we say to people, you know what, folks, we're working in a completely different realm. And the reality is we need to make it up as we go. And I think historically, before we started seeing our economy melt down and some of the challenges that we've had to deal with, we've had this false sense of security that we can continue to do what we've always done. And I think when we're working in this kind of climate, we need to recognize we have to do something differently, and we don't have the recipe yet. We have to get comfortable with the fact that we will figure it out as we go. And that's challenging for people. Openness to novelty, we've already talked about how important that is. And then tolerance for risk. And I think if we just reframe risk from the standpoint of, okay, how bad is it going to be, and what am I going to learn from it, and how is it going to help me get closer, I think it makes it a little easier to take some of those risks. Some of the other skills that we get involved in, if you can't use your imagination, you aren't going to be able to be creative. And I think we just need to take more opportunities to connect to what's possible. Sensing gaps is simply understanding where you are, where you need to be, and what are you going to do about it. Playfulness, I think we forget about this. There's a really interesting book by the name, gentleman by the name of Stuart Brown. It's called Play. And he has gone and profiled 8 different types of play that people have engaged in. And what's really interesting, if you read that book, you start to connect with how you like to play, and that starts to give you some insights on how you're creative. And I think that's a really neat way to connect with that and recognize we need a little bit of that playfulness in our workplaces, and so we can toy with the ideas we're working with. One of the other things that happens is recognizing that you need to avoid premature closure. As humans, we're hardwired to bring things to conclusion. If we're being creative, we have to be hardwired to leave it open a little bit longer. And so it's a little bit of a shift in our habits in doing that. And then sensitivity to the environment. I think this is where emotional intelligence and kind of recognizing a little bit more about what's going on with the people and the physical environment, how are people responding to the challenges, those sorts of things. That's something that's really important there. And then the final one is my favorite. And this is one of the ways that I talk to the executives that I'm working with. There's a lot of stuff out there around this thing called mindfulness and awareness. There is a very beautifully pinned down definition. There was some really interesting research that actually came out of a group at University of Toronto, a group of psychologists banded with about 13 others throughout North America, and they said, we're hearing way too much about this. We need to start looking at what this really means and make it tangible. And this is the definition. This is an adaptation from the definition that they came up with. And basically, as leaders, I think we need to step above the process and what's going on and look at it critically from the standpoint of what are we doing, what are we noticing, how are we feeling, and what does that do to inform what we next need to do. And so I think there's a different level of awareness or self-awareness that we need to bring to the decisions and the leading that we do so that we can help people move through this stuff a lot more creatively.